What's up, Shred Sexies? Welcome back. Death to the Fingers. We got some questions on how to dial in a great guitar tone. So I'm going to go over some of the basics here with you. This comes from years of sort of like trying to set up the recording templates and then playing around with the gear and everything else. So I'm showing it in the digital medium. You'll have to think outside the box a little bit with respect to how to adapt these ideas over to a more physical medium like an actual amp and head and all the rest of that. But it can be done. Right. So, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but the first big one is impedance. Okay. This Z function here, essentially on mine, I've got it set to auto, but the cable that the guitar plugs in to the amp with has resistance. So it's actually fighting the signal that's coming from the pickup. So if you play around with this impedance on your amp, which a lot of them have now, or with respect to your digital setup, you'll be like, wow, that actually makes a huge improvement to the guitar sound right out of the gate. Okay? Now listen, I'm using Fishman Fluence pickups, which are like some of the most cleanest sounding pickups you can get that are more digital in nature. So everything that I have synergizes to do what I want to do. So that's why this Z input is set to auto. I don't really have to do anything because everything's already sort of set up to do the digital transfer, right? But if this was a real guitar with real pickup, or not a real guitar, but like real sort of pickups using the old-fashioned magnet technology, you are most definitely going to want to mess around with this and get it dialed in properly, especially depending on the kind of cables you're using. I have really expensive cables that were given to me, so their impedance is incredibly low, right? So I don't have to worry about the sort of any blocking of the signal because it's just pouring down there like like a fire hose. But in other cables, cheaper ones, you're going to run into a problem here. So I'm just letting you know. Next on the list is distortion. That's the first thing essentially your guitar is going to plug into. Again, this impedance function is going to be on your actual amp. If you have that, if you don't have it, it'll be on the input of your Helix or your Axifex or whatever it is. Just look it up in the menu, and then you're into distortion here. Again, I'm basically shelving the guitar high-low pass filter. Now, I was using the Horizon drive, but I switched it over to the Prize drive because the distortion is a little bit more sort of round and natural. It's kind of a cross between the Klon and the Tube Screamer, right? So I could pump the drive here, make it more extreme. It was only 1 when I was using the Horizon drive, but it's 4 in this case with the Prize drive. And then I could pump the drive on the actual amp too. So pushing both of them together made the sound fatter rather than this thing created a ton of distortion, right? But then I had to dial back some, sacrifice, if you will, on the amp because it would just get unruly if you added too much distortion. But by adding a pedal that has sort of more sort of subdued distortion and then blending that with the more aggressive distortion from the amp itself gave me the perfect balance. So there it is. Sometimes getting the pedal that has like the most extreme distortion or whatever it is not always the solution. It really depends on your rig. So if you're using a low gain amp or a high gain amp or something in between or whatever it is, it could be solid state or tube. So do your research, but that was the consideration there. And honestly, this part of it is not to distort the guitar signal. It's to compress it to a certain degree because that's what distortion does. It compresses this dynamic signal coming from my guitar. And then I'm also dirtying it up a little bit beforehand so I don't have to do as much work in the amp stage, and it controls that distortion so I have more control and focus over how the transients are going to translate in terms of like attack when I'm picking and whatnot, which is really what you're shooting for, clarity of sound, right? When I pick things or I'm fretting on the fretboard, it translates without me having to become Hercules or whatever. So next is of course just a noise gate. When this thing's dialed in, obviously, when I'm not playing, if you've ever played with a distortion pedal, you're going to get that immediate feedback loop, right? Where it's just, it's really nasty. All this is doing is just filtering that out. Doesn't actually add anything to the sound. Now, in this case, I am using the Horizon gate because it's awesome. for this particular function of gating. But again, all it's doing is controlling the signal. When I'm not playing guitar, it chops this off so you don't hear all the distortion from the pedal, and I don't have to turn it off. It's just always on, right? Done. Next is the amp itself. I'm using a 5150 emulation here. Again, I push the drive. The magic's in the mid-range, so I'm pumping the low end in the mids. Of course, I'm keeping the presence and the treble relative. This is the danger zone with guitar. This is angry mosquito stuff. 6K, 2 to 3K. Those are very, very harsh frequencies in the distortion of electric guitars. Avoid. So if you're getting too psycho here, your mix is just going to sound absolutely terrible. And plus, it doesn't translate in a live situation. This is where all the magic happens, in the low end and the mid-range. This is just for a little bit of sparkle on the top, right? Another one is you can see the master volume and the channel volume. I'm kind of pumping the drive and the channel volume at the same time to get the overall distortion mixed in with this one. So it's those three elements together, and then I control the overall volume with this master out. The last one that's really important, obviously, is the resonance, which this is obviously huge. It just acts as like an inflator, if you will, with respect to distortion sounds, just making them sound absolutely monstrous and punishing. So make of that what you will. But of course, having said that, high gain amps have major level drawbacks in terms of cleans, where clean amps, you need to have a lot more gear to make the distortions sound better, but they do sound better overall. A Dumble with sort of like a suite of pedals to go into a distortion mode is going to sound a lot better than like the Uberschall, which is just designed to be an absolutely super psycho overdriven amp. So food for thought there, okay? Dial this in as you feel, best represents your sound, but some of the big principles: the distortion pedal works in conjunction with the drive, the channel volume and the master volume, right? Then resonance, bass, and mids all work together to create the sort of like chunkiness of your sound. Control the top end here by just messing around with the treble and presence. That's a big one. Next on the list, of course, is the IR, in this case, or the cabinet. I just got these ones, York Audio. They make some of the best IRs I've ever heard. This one's the 5153 brand. I'm using the mixed version of the drop tuning, I guess. It's absolutely phenomenal, but they're all pretty good. The Own Hammer stuff, the 3 Sigma 6 is, I think, another one. But the York Audio ones that I just picked up, again, absolutely ridiculous. But here's the magic. The low end cut, look at that, 90 hertz. Everything below 90 hertz is gone completely. You don't even hear it. I've cut it off. That is all the mud, rumble, and sort of dirt in your guitar sound that you don't want. In this case, it can almost be pumped up to 100 hertz, but this is the sweet spot for this one here with respect to the rest of the configuration. 90 hertz, high cut. This thing goes up to like 20K, and I'm cutting everything off after 8. Okay, which lets me, again, this high cut and low cut also works with the amp settings, right? Don't forget that. When I'm cutting to 90 hertz, I'm sort of coming back here and messing around with the bass and treble function, or bass and mid function too, to sort of even everything out, right? Same thing with the high and the presence here. I'm basically matching that up here with the high cut where it goes to the 8K. Now listen, I'd cut everything at 8K first and then go back to the amp and then start messing with the treble and presence until I get it to be like that's where it sounds the best. Everything above 8K here in the guitar realm is totally unnecessary, and it's just creating a bunch of high-end fizz that's killing your guitar sound. Same thing with the low range. Everything below literally 80 hertz is just mud and garbage. You're getting in the way of the bass guitar and the kick, and it's as simple as that. You're piling all these frequencies onto each other, and it's creating phase cancellation. It's making your jams sound terrible, making your live sound really flat and dull, and it's sort of weak, and your recordings are suffering too. All because of this one little thing. This is the one thing I've done in 3 years that has made the biggest difference in all of my guitar sound. This right here. Done. okay? And having really high quality IRs. There's no substitute for having really good ones. They're $15 for about 60 of these things. I mean, there's so many 20 mixed variations, and then there's got to be at least another 40 or 50 that are, you know, a whole bunch of different variants. They work for every single one, Kemper and Axe Effects and Line 6, everything. It's fantastic. Good stuff. Good job, York Audio. You guys rock. Last but not least here is the EQ, basically more control. Now, listen, I can do this with respect to the Helix, right? But in this one, you might have to actually take the EQ and put it before the amp and then do the balancing over here, right? I can do it after this cabinet because obviously you're not going to be able to do the things I just talked about with a real cabinet. So this has got to go over there before, and you got to do all the mixing part in the first 4 string here, which would be the distortion into the noise gate going into an EQ now, pumping up the low end, and then balancing everything with respect to the amp here, and then just finally having the static speaker. But because I have the digital stuff, which is on purpose, I now have this extra level of functionality. Make of that information what you will, right? So I'm, again, making a big cut here, 80 hertz. I'm, again, pumping the mid-range 250 to about 800. Big jump there. Obviously, you're like 2 dB. Yeah, it's pretty significant. About 0.3 dB is a pretty big jump. You're like, that's noticeable. Again, controlling the high end. Look at 2K to about 7K. That is like the danger zone. So you want to make sure you control that. That's one of the worst frequencies in the guitar. It'll take your head off, and it just robs of it any sort of real juicy power. When you start pumping these frequencies, it just nukes these ones down here, which is where all the real awesomeness of the guitar actually lives. So food for thought. Now, in my little diagram here, I have a modulator. This is off. It's only turned on when I want to use chorus or a phaser or something like that, and that's very, very rarely. It's just in the chain there. And obviously before the delay, because what's happening here with the delay is I'm just fattening up the sound. That's it. It's not actually a delay traditionally in the sense of, you know, just with repeats and whatnot. I've got a pretty long sort of like delay time, if you will, but it's barely in the mix, 10%, you know, with 11% feedback. So the way it works is a little subtle. It's hard to detect, but once you start messing around with the delay time, when you've got it really low like this between, say, 10 and 15%, it's really more like 10 and 12% for any of them, or 8 to 12% might be another one if you're starting to factor in rhythms. This might be down to about 8%. When you start messing around with the time here, you can really notice it sort of fatten up your guitar sound and turn it from like this more digital sound to a much more believable analog sound. So this is kind of a little hack I developed, if you will. I don't know if other people have come up with it too, but they probably have, to just take these more pure sounds where it's, you know, less variable, and you give it like this little mojo. Don't ask. I don't know why. And it really works with the simple delay. I have other ones here, but this one, it just is the easiest because it just does what I'm trying to accomplish, which is just make the guitar sound a little fatter without actually boosting an EQ range in the low end. If that makes sense, you know what I mean? I'm kind of like doubling up the signal, if you will, or muddying up the water. I don't know, however you want to see that. But the delay function here is effectively adding more signal so it sounds fatter and more rich. So there it is, the whole sequence there, going back to the beginning. Check your impedance, dial that in. If you have an input gate, fine. Be careful here. You should basically, if you leave your guitar, unless you put your hand over the strings, you're not really hearing the gate come. If it's just, you know, the guitar is sitting wide open to the air, it just sounds like strings kind of ringing out kind of deal. And then when you put your hands over the strings, then this sort of threshold kicks in. Too much on the input gate can really kill your guitar sound, even if you plan on pumping some of this stuff. So don't mess with that too much. The impedance is way more important. Z. Right, next is choose a distortion pedal. If you already have a crazy high gain amp, you're going to probably want to use a pedal that is less gain. If you're using a clean amp like a Fender Twin, you're probably going to want to switch over to the Horizon Drive, which has got way more distortion, sort of focused distortion. Let's put it that way. Not way more distortion. It's all relative. And of course, understand this is basically shelving your guitar. It's creating a low high pass filter, the first of many high-low pass filters. You might be noticing that, right? So that's a done deal. Then into the noise gate, it's really just controlling this distortion sound, preventing it from hitting the amp when I'm not playing my guitar. Done. I love that part. Of course, this is me just dialing in my amp. I'm using the 5150. I used to have it, but they're all good. You could use the Angle Meteor and stuff like that. Now listen, you probably have to mess around with the IR. I have the Mesa Boogie ones, Marshall, and the 5150s, and you might even need to get a couple more to really make some of these heads work properly. You have to match up the IR with the head. That is a big mistake I made for several years. That's why I went and specifically got one for the 5150, because when I did that, huge difference. Now, I already had ones that were 5150 Van Halen ones, but these ones are just more high quality. Of course, I've already gone through dialing it in to a certain degree. The magic's in the mid-range. Be careful of that top end. Make sure you're balancing things in like groups, bass, mid, resonance, and then you have drive, channel volume, and master volume mixed with the distortion pedals volume and its drive, and any top end that comes from this will be matched up with the top end of that. So you're starting to see there's this weird web happening, but you can handle it because you're amazing. Next on the list is we have the IR 8K and 100 hertz. That's the range. That's where all the magic happens with the guitar. Everything outside that is totally unnecessary. Get rid of it. Trust me, you will thank me. If you drop this to 8K, then go back to your amp and start dialing in the high end, in addition with the high end if there's one on your distortion pedal and whatnot. And of course, there's the EQ here that comes afterwards. You can sort of rebalance things, but trust me, getting rid of this part here and then adding more top end to it later after will make a much, much better sort of difference overall. I don't know if that actually came out right. Close enough. Right, I'm using an EQ here. Normally, you would actually either have to put this in front, and if you're doing the delay trick, you'd probably have to do it in parallel with your amp head through the effects loop. That's fine. But again, you're basically starting to control the low end, pump the mid-range, control the high end. And of course, you can see it's still, you know, despite the fact that I've taken it down, it's still actually affecting the sound regardless. It's still adding this 22 hertz or whatever it is, 22K or 2.2K, I should say, to the actual guitar sound. I'm just taking it down from the 0 point to slightly less. So it creates like this little sort of parabolic scoop in the actual sound and whatnot, which, you know, when these things are all building up and stuff like that, at this point here, me taking it down a little bit just sort of balances it all out again. You know, it's starting to get extreme by the stage. So me taking it down a little bit, boom, brings it back into balance. Last but not least, the delay. Of course, I already mentioned it running in parallel here. I can just do it right after this because that's the beauty of digital. And boom, I'm just using this to fatten it up. Bring the feedbacks way down. Bring the mix way down. Start playing with the time until you get it to where you want. Avoid using reverb unless you're doing like a very effecty thing, right? Reverb can be the kiss of death on the guitar unless done properly. And if you're doing it properly, you're going to sound like Devin Townsend, which I don't know. He's got kind of a very unique sound. I don't know if you want to go down that road. People will instantly be like, you Devin clone. And you might even have made a really good album. So, you know, I'm just warning you in advance. I hope that helps and gives you some ideas and stuff like that about how to, you know, control the output here and whatnot, about what you're really getting into. Because honestly, the fact of the matter is that most people's mistakes with sound is they're not getting rid of certain frequencies. They're adding them, and they're adding them in such a way that they pile on top of each other. And when they start piling on top of each other, and then you start adding other instruments in, another the guitar, then the bass, the drums, the singing, your whole mix just goes to hell. But if you start constraining frequency ranges for the guitar between 100 and 8K, and the bass goes between like 40 and like 5K kind of situation, I think you'll find that all of a sudden your band practices sound like really professional and whatnot, and your recordings go way up, and it's way, way, way easier to mix. These stages right here save you literally hours of mixing later on. So I've covered all the basics. Thanks for joining me. I appreciate every single one of you. I hope this helps you get an even more killer guitar sound. I'll leave it to you to figure out the clean stuff because it's easy. It's even easier. But again, the pairing of the amp with the cabinet, important. EQing the sound, either before or after, important. Up to you to decide. Adding effects, either before or after, important. Start messing with stuff and start to understand and come up with some basic rules to be like, these are sort of how you get the best sound. And the sequence, trust me, when I was first doing it, I went into this, then the amp, and then I had the noise gate over here. Mistake. Once I moved it into the middle here, made a huge difference. Once I moved the EQ to the end, another major level sort of like aha moment with the digital stuff. Now all of a sudden I had a really, really killer guitar sound. Done. See you in the next one.